I learned that for the founders, as Cicero said, happiness was not feeling good, it was being good. It was not the pursuit of immediate pleasure, but the pursuit of long-term virtue. And by virtue, the founders meant something particular.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors and Boston Public Library. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs at American Ancestors, the creator of this series, and a co-host tonight. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us in the land of American history, looking at its founding documents, the philosophy and intention behind them, a topic just perfect for the days following the July 4th celebration. On your screen is the schedule for our 60-minute event centered on the book, The Pursuit of Happiness, How Classical Writers on Virtue Inspired the Lives of the Founders and Defined America. Now, turning you over to tonight's co-host from the Boston Public Library, Kristen, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Margaret, and from the Boston Public Library, welcome. I'm Kristen Motti. I'm an adult programs librarian at the Central Library of the Boston Public Library, and we're delighted to be in partnership this evening on tonight's program with American Ancestors and the GBH Forum Network. Now I have the privilege of introducing tonight's author, Jeffrey Rosen. Jeff Rosen is president and CEO of the National Constitution Center, where he hosts We the People, a weekly podcast of constitutional debate. He is also a professor of law at George Washington University Law School and a contributing editor of The Atlantic. He is the author of 7 previous books, including the New York Times bestseller, Conversations with RBG, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg on Life, Love, Liberty, and Law. His essays and commentaries have appeared in a range of notable publications. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and Jeff, welcome. We're looking forward to your talk. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And hello, friends. Happy July 4th. It is wonderful to be with you and to talk about the pursuit of happiness. Let me tell you how I came upon this unusual project, which has changed my life. It's changed the way I think about how to be a good person and a good citizen, and changed the way I think about the founders. And then I'll look forward to having a conversation and taking your questions. So it was during COVID that I noticed that both Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson had made lists of 12 or 13 virtues for daily living. Franklin, in particular, had made a list of 13 virtues and recommended that each night we take account of how well we've succeeded in living up to them. And I knew about this project because I tried it a few years ago at the suggestion of a rabbi in Washington, D.C., who recommended that a friend and I try the Hebrew version. Turns out that there was a Hasidic rabbi in the early 19th century who admired Franklin and translated his Virtues project into Hebrew. A friend and I tried it for a while. We found it very depressing because it's you have to put an X mark each night next to the virtues you've fallen short. There are so many X marks that we soon gave it up, although we thought we were better for having tried. It turned out that Franklin did the exact same thing. He each night would take account of whether he lived up to virtues like temperance and prudence and justice. And he found that there were a lot of X marks too, and eventually gave up his project to achieve moral perfection, but he thought that he was better for having tried. What struck me during COVID is that Franklin chose as a motto for his project a book that I hadn't heard of before, Cicero's Tusculan Disputations. And the motto was, without virtue, happiness cannot be. What struck me about this book is that I noticed soon after that Thomas Jefferson had also chosen the same book by Cicero as the encapsulation of his understanding of the pursuit of happiness. I was at the Boar's Head Inn in Charlottesville, Virginia, near the UVA campus, and noticed on the wall of the room a list of 12 virtues that Jefferson had drafted for his daughters. And they're surprisingly similar to Franklin's. They're based on the classical virtues of temperance, prudence, courage, and justice. And they include practical advice like when angry, count to 10, or when very angry, 100. resolve to do what you ought and do what you resolve. And Jefferson also chose Cicero as his motto. When Jefferson was old and people would write to him and ask, what's the secret of happiness? He would write back with a long passage from Cicero. And it said, he who has achieved tranquility of soul, who's neither unduly exuberant nor unduly despondent, he is the wise man of whom we are in quest. He's the happy man. Okay, so when I realized that both Jefferson and Franklin had chosen as their mottos a book by Cicero and a definition of happiness that was based in virtue, I figured that I had to read Cicero. I have had a wonderful liberal arts education. I've studied great books with great teachers. I was an English major in college and studied Puritan theology and went on to study history and politics and philosophy and law. But I missed these books of moral philosophy, of which Cicero was the exemplar. And I realized how deeply I was moved to fill this gap in my education when I came across a reading list that Jefferson would send to people who asked him how to be educated. When he was old, people were always asking him, what should we read? And Jefferson would send this reading list. You can find it. It's his letter to Robert Skipwith was the initial version of it, and he revised it throughout his years. And it has all sorts of categories, as well as recommending a schedule for when you should read the books at what time of day. And it is a rigorous reading schedule. You're supposed to get up before sunrise, read for a few hours while the mind is clear, watch the sunrise, saving the moral philosophy for the morning. Later in the morning, you're allowed some political philosophy and history, then lunch, then some science, astronomy, and math, and then dinner, when you can indulge in some Shakespeare and poetry, and then to bed 12 hours a day, 7 days a week without fail. What really caught my eye was the section that Jefferson sometimes called natural religion and sometimes ethics. And there at the top of this section was Cicero, the Tusculan Disputation, and also On Duties, and then other books of classical Greek and Roman moral philosophy, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, as well as some Enlightenment moral philosophy, John Locke, Francis Hutcheson, Lord Hume, Lord Bolingbroke. During COVID, I set out to read these books just to fill a gap in my education. And moved by Jefferson and by the fact that we had more time during COVID, I found myself following this improbable reading schedule, getting up before sunrise, reading for 2 hours, watching the sunrise, and then I found myself moved to write sonnets summing up the wisdom that I'd learned. I know this seems weird, like an unusual practice, but it turns out that lots of people in the founding era would read this moral philosophy and write sonnets, including the great Phyllis Wheatley, the first published Black poet, Alexander Hamilton, Mercy Otis Warren, the great anti-federalist and hero of Boston, and John Quincy Adams, who would wake up in the morning, spend a year in the White House reading Cicero in the original, and then would write beautiful sonnets summing up his wisdom. So that's what I did for a year. And what I read and found came as a revelation. I learned that for the founders, as Cicero said, happiness was not feeling good, it was being good. It was not the pursuit of immediate pleasure, but the pursuit of long-term virtue. And by virtue, the founders meant something particular, self-improvement, character improvement, being your best self, using your powers of reason to master your unreasonable passions or emotions so that you could achieve the calm tranquility that defined, for the founders, happiness. There's this constant antithesis in the literature, both the classical and the Enlightenment, between reason and passion. And the founders, by saying that we should use our reason to master our passions, didn't mean that we should lack passion. Passion is a synonym for emotion. In Greek, pathos, reason is logos. They meant that we should moderate or temper our unreasonable passions so we can achieve calm tranquility. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg summed up the classical wisdom when she shared with me some advice her mom gave to her. Justice Ginsburg's mother told her, don't be distracted by unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear. They'll distract you from productive work. And that is the essence of the classical wisdom, and it just pervades all of the literature. So after completely having my understanding of happiness transformed by this wonderful reading, I set out to ask, how did the founders apply this wisdom in their own lives? And that's what the book is about, and that's what I want to talk to you about now, is to share with you some of the major founders and how they absorbed this wisdom into their lives. And what's remarkable is that they talked constantly about their efforts to calm their anxieties, to be better people. They were constantly beating themselves up for not being productive enough or temperate enough or self-controlled enough. Always spurred them to do better. They fell short of their ideals in many respects, most notoriously slavery, which I'll talk about in just a bit in the context of the enslaving founders, most notably Jefferson. But they were quite self-aware about their own hypocrisies. And what's so inspiring about their journey is that they never stopped trying to improve themselves and use their time mindfully. And in particular, if there's a takeaway for this quest, and there is, I'll say that it's so inspiring that until the end of their lives, the founders were deep readers. And seeing Jefferson and Adams at the end of their lives trading book recommendations and constantly learning and growing inspired me to change my habits. And I'd fallen out of the habit of deep reading for stuff outside of my immediate deadlines. And just this unexpected, unusual COVID-era schedule of getting up early, watching the sunrise and reading is one I tried to carry on. And my new rule, I don't catch the sunrise every day these days. It's rising at about 5:40 here in the East. But the rule is that I'm not allowed to browse in the morning. If I do read on Kindle often, and when I pick up my phone, I'm not permitted to check email or to do any browsing, and I've got to actually read books. And you do that for an hour or two every morning, and it's just remarkable how exciting the worlds that are open to you are. So that's what I'm urging and sharing with you. I've become an evangelist for the radically transformative power of deep reading, and it's a gift that I got from this COVID-era reading schedule. Okay, let me now talk about several of the major founders, and I'll begin with Franklin, and I guess we can put up his picture just to take a moment to think about how remarkable it was that at the end of his long life, when people asked Franklin, what do you owe your success to? He attributed to his habits of moderation and conciliation, his prudent temper, which led him never to assert himself too aggressively. He would never say, this is the way it is, but I think it may be so, or perhaps you might consider. And that moderating temperament allowed him to preside over the Constitutional Convention. And he gave that inspiring speech at the end where he said, I'm not sure that this is perfect. It's not exactly what I would have done, but it's as good as we can get. And I'm calling for unanimity because I can't imagine it could be better. And by asking the delegates to have a little humility, to doubt of their own perfection, he helped persuade the delegates to pass the Constitution. And isn't it incredible that he's the most famous man in the world at this point? He's tamed the Gulf Stream and brought lightning from the heavens. And what he's most grateful for is not his scientific genius or his diplomatic achievements, but his moderate and conciliating temper. So that's Franklin. Now we must talk, because it is Boston and the great, all of you are so inspired by the noble Boston tradition. Let's talk about John and Abigail Adams. Isn't it remarkable? Well, first of all, they're so mindful about their efforts in self-improvement. And when they first meet, their dating strategy is to make a list of each other's faults. Not necessarily a great strategy when you're starting off, but they're inspired by Pythagoras, because Pythagoras, in his golden verses, the same verses that inspired Franklin to make his Virtues Project, recommends that each night before bed you make a list of your faults. So John and Abigail do this. Abigail is very generous to John. She says, well, your only fault is that you're so brilliant that some people might find you intellectually intimidating. And John says, well, your faults are that you should practice the piano more and read more, plus you're pigeon-toed. And Abigail takes this with good humor. She says, I'll try to practice the piano more and read more, but as for my being pigeon-toed, a gentleman should never comment on a lady's posture. They're always talking about using reason to master passions. Abigail's favorite verse is from the Proverbs. He who is slow to anger is greater than he who has taken a village. She also often quotes Pythagoras's axiom, reverence thyself. And John, in his diaries at Harvard and after, is constantly taking notes about the moral philosophy he's read, both Burlamaqui, the Swiss political theorist, as well as Wurlitzen and Tollitzen, the most popular preachers of their day, acolytes of what was called reasonable Christianity, who believed that reason could be reconciled with faith, and just taking notes in order to persuade himself to be better. But always, what is his anchor? Cicero. And there's this great moment when his parents are fighting in the other room. They're having a domestic squabble, and he goes into the other room and reads Cicero to calm himself down in his copy of Cicero. He writes in big letters, John Adams, his book. And he and his son, John Quincy, always return to Cicero as their touchstone. Adams, I organized the book into chapters where different founders are paired with different virtues, jumping off of Franklin's list. And for John, it had to be humility, because he's one of the most famously self-regarding men of his age. From the musical 1776, I'm obnoxious and dislike that cannot be denied. And he's constantly raging at the fact that he's not getting enough credit for the American Revolution. He denounces the grand Franklin, who's getting all the credit, or Jefferson, who gets the credit for writing the Declaration, even though Adams says it was he, Adams, he speaks of himself in the third person, who really came up with the ideas behind the Declaration. He has terrible fights with his friends, in particular, Otis Warren and Jefferson. But the remarkable and significant thing is that he makes up, and he wears his heart on his sleeve. In some ways, he's among the most relatable founders, as we would say today, because he's so self-aware. He's flawed. He loses his temper, but then he keeps it, and he makes up. Otis Warren, what a great daughter of Boston, a heroic figure, not allowed a classical education at Harvard because women are not permitted then, but she has a fine education with her brother, James Otis. She sort of sits in on his lessons at home, becomes a great classicist, and then becomes one of the great dramatists and satirists of her age. John Adams calls her the poetical genius of the Revolution, because she writes these satires, The Adulator and so forth, ridiculing the British Tories. Although they're hand in glove during the Revolution, she has a falling out with Adams over politics. She writes a multi-volume history of the Revolution from an anti-federalist Jeffersonian perspective. There are 5 pages that call Adams a monarchist, the standard Jeffersonian charge against the Federalists and Adams. He storms and rages and says, how dare you? She won't apologize. And they break it off for a while. But then they make up, and Abigail sends Mercy a lock of her hair, and they begin to correspond again. And Mercy says to John Adams, I've just got one favor to ask. You're the only one who knows that I wrote The Adulator, but if you go to the Boston Athenaeum, some guy has taken credit for the piece. You're the only one who knows I wrote it. Can you certify that? John says, absolutely. You're the only genius who could have written The Adulator. Gets on his horse, rides to Boston, goes to the Athenaeum, and writes on the title page, this was written by Otis Warren. Friends, if you're nearby, check it out. Go to the Athenaeum this week. And I don't know if they're displaying it at the moment, but ask to see it. And you should be able to see Adams's attestation to Mercy Otis Warren's authorship, a great tribute to his capacity for friendship and forgiveness. And then there's his breakup and then reconciliation with Jefferson, one of the great moments in American political and intellectual history, where after they, the nation almost splits over the election of 1800, Adams doesn't attend the inauguration, but then they do reconcile. Benjamin Rush brings them back together. They start writing, and in one of the great epistolary exchanges of American history, what do they want to talk about most when they're old? Comparative spirituality, really, and their own quest to achieve happiness, and the books they've read. And Adams is so excited to learn that Pythagoras, the founder of Greek moral philosophy, may have traveled to the East and read the Hindu Vedas. And he's so eager to find out whether Joseph Priestley lived long enough to complete his book on the doctrines of the ancient Hindus. And Jefferson says, good news, he lived, I'll send you the book. And then Adams believes that this will show that all of the wisdom of the East and West can be traced back to the common wisdom of the East embodied in Gandhi's axiom in the Gita: renounce and enjoy, renounce attachment to external events and enjoy eternal bliss and salvation. And Adams says that he would sum up all of the wisdom in his own axiom, love God and all his creatures, rejoice in all things. And he attributes this to the myth of Cleanthes. It's just inspiring, friends, to see these great men with the quest, the hunger for lifelong learning at the end of their lives, creating book recommendations and attempting to synthesize the spiritual wisdom in ways that are uniquely their own. And then Jefferson, at the end of a long life, he'd begun as a kind of Stoic. He'd been copying passages from Cicero into his commonplace book when his dad died when he was 14. On mature reflection, he announces to John Adams, I am now an Epicurean. And by an Epicurean, he doesn't mean a hedonist or a wanton pleasure seeker. That's a libel on Epicurus by the Stoics, says Jefferson. Instead, thoughtful Epicureans believe in the contraction of rational desires so that we can meet those desires. The Stoics want to overcome desire entirely and believe that the goal in life is an absence of pain, not the seeking of pleasure. The Epicureans think that's unrealistic, but they don't want immediate gratification or pleasure seeking, but rational pleasure seeking so we can achieve long-term well-being. And Jefferson gives a doctrine of the Epicureans and says he is an Epicurean, a remarkable exercise in spiritual depth. This brings us to the question of Jefferson and slavery, and there he is on the screen. How is it possible that this man who devoted himself to a life of virtue and declared that all men are created equal was such a notorious enslaver? How could he justify this hypocrisy? And the answer is that he didn't even try, nor did any of the enslavers from Virginia. I was so struck to come across a quotation from Patrick Henry after he's given the "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, quoting from Cato's letters. Henry says, "Is it not amazing that I myself, who believe slavery violates the Bible and natural law, myself own slaves? I will not justify it. I won't attempt to. It's simple avarice or greed. I can't do with the inconvenience of living without it." And in that moment of stark, brutal candor, Henry was expressing a truth that they all knew and sometimes expressed in their more self-aware moments. They knew it was wrong, but they liked the lifestyle and didn't want to give it up. And isn't it significant that they use that classical phrase, avarice or greed? The virtue is industry and the vice is avarice. And they had it because they just liked the lifestyle. No one more than Jefferson, who surrounds himself at Monticello as this sort of Palladian fantasy of agrarian virtue, all the while that he's surrounded by not only an enslaved population, but his own children. And the people who are serving him in his house are his kids. By Sally Hemings, he promises her that he will free them on his death when they're both in Paris. That's her condition for coming back to the US. He does, in fact, keep that promise and frees two of his children on his death in his will. Two of the others he's allowed to escape. But he frees none of the rest of his enslaved population, and they are sold to pay his debts. The man who insists that the earth lives in usufruct for the living and that one generation can't impose its debts on another, imposes crushing debts on his own daughters, and his enslaved population is sold, and parents are separated from kids, and the brutality of his hypocrisy is exposed. The other thing that's shocking about Jefferson is the degree of his racism, which is unusual even by the standards of his day. And that is no more obvious than in his encounters with the great Phillis Wheatley. And why don't we have a picture of her right now? Phillis Wheatley is the first published Black poet. She comes over as a young teenager enslaved from Africa. She is given reading lessons by her mistress, who for some reason allows her to sit in on the lessons of their kids. And she becomes a great classicist and begins to write brilliant poems of virtue, praising the virtues of self-mastery, talking about the need for virtue, and then taking up the cause of the American Revolution. And she writes to George Washington, who acclaims her poetical genius and receives her respectfully. Then the city of Boston does something remarkable, and it's so great to be talking about this with all of you. Some doubt that an enslaved Black person could write such brilliant poems, so the city decides to hold an examination of whether she wrote her own poems. And a committee is formed. It's presided over by John Hancock. It includes Cotton Mather and all the great worthies of the town. And they conduct an examination. Apparently, it's a virtual, not an in-person exam, but they are kind of quizzing her on her classical knowledge. Professor Henry Louis Gates imagines questions like, who are the nine muses? And she, in the event, passes with flying colors. These worthies certify pompously that she has written her own poems. And then she becomes an international celebrity. And she goes to London. She's received by the Duke and Duchess. She meets Franklin. She's given the key to the city. She becomes, again, in Professor Gates's words, the Oprah Winfrey of her day. She's an international celebrity. Her genius acclaimed by all except for Thomas Jefferson. And in his notes on the state of Virginia, he has a shocking passage where he says that the poetry of Phillis Wheatley, he misspells her name, is beneath contempt. And basically because in Jefferson's view, Black people can't be good poets. He contrasts them with the poets of Rome, like Terence, who were enslaved white poets. And he says, Black people, he says, I venture this as a suspicion, only are intellectually inferior. He wants to be proved wrong. And he dismisses Wheatley's poetry. It's a shocking and virulent reaction by the sage of Monticello, and it's very much to Jefferson's discredit that, although, until the end of his life, he continued always to insist that slavery should be ended at some point in the distant future, and never attempted to justify it as the next generation of enslavers did, like John Calhoun, who said that the Declaration was a self-evident lie and asserting that all men are created equal. Jefferson never did that, but he both never acted in practice to end slavery and then also displayed this really shocking racism. Contrast that with George Washington. And why don't we have Washington now, who, if Jefferson becomes more racist on examination, Washington becomes greater. And Washington's greatness consists in his self-mastery and self-control. He's constantly struggling to control his temper. He has a fierce temper, often displayed in exchanges with his mom. Ron Chernow, his great biographer, thinks that it may have been the hypercritical Martha Washington that led George to constantly be trying to keep himself under control so he doesn't lose it. He's seen to lose his temper on very few occasions in public. On the battlefield once, when his orders are disobeyed. Once when he goes to Congress to deliver a message in person and they disrespect him and talk over him, and he storms out and says, this defeats the purpose of my coming here. But generally he's glacial and majestic in his self-control. And there's the great moment at Newburgh toward the end of the war, where there's a danger of mutiny because the soldiers haven't been paid. Congress can't raise taxes to pay the troops and keeps delaying payment to the soldiers. There's a fear that they may mutiny. And Washington mounts what he calls the Temple of Virtue, which is a wooden platform specially constructed for the occasion. He's had a performance of Addison's Cato performed for the troops. It's his favorite play, and it embodies what he calls the mild consolations of philosophy, according to the Stoic ideal. And Washington goes to read a speech urging the troops to achieve patience. He's calling on them to practice the classical virtues. If they can just wait a little longer, he'll ensure that they're paid. And he goes to read his speech, and he famously puts on his reading glasses and says, "Forgive me, gentlemen, I'm grown old in your service, and now I've grown almost blind." And the soldiers weep. They'd never seen him confess weakness before, and he's never seemed so great as is this moment of self-control. That's Washington. At the end of his life, Washington insists in the farewell address that he's not sure that the experiment will succeed, and he calls on the citizens of the United States to achieve virtue. They've got to virtuously study history so that they can learn from the lessons of the past and also be virtuous and master their anger, or else they'll descend into factions and not elect wise and virtuous leaders who, through their own fine character and self-control, can keep the republic. And Washington helped me see the connection between personal self-government and political self-government, which is so crucial to the founders, and it's most embodied in the Federalist Papers. So if we now have Madison or Hamilton, we can recognize that the Federalist Papers are a manual for public happiness, a phrase that appears constantly in the Federalist Papers. And Madison's famous definition of faction in the Federalist Papers is any group, a majority or a minority, animated by passion rather than reason, devoted to self-interest rather than the public good. There's that reason-passion distinction. And just as individuals have to master their unreasonable passions and emotions in the constitution of their own minds, so groups have to master their passions in the constitution of the state. And that's why the whole Constitution is set up through separation of powers and checks and balances and federalism and vertical and horizontal checks to prevent factions from forming quickly. Madison believes that in America, it's an answer to the classical understanding that you could only have democracies or self-governing assemblies in large, rather in small communities where people could deliberate face to face. And the Athenian assembly is 6,000 people. Madison says, with a new innovation representative government, you can actually have a republic over a larger territory, and the large size of America will be a benefit because it'll be hard for mobs or factions to organize. And by the time they do, they'll get tired and go home. Remember, the reason the Constitutional Convention is held is because of Shays' Rebellion in Western Massachusetts. So much of it comes back to Massachusetts, friends. And when Daniel Shays leads the Debtors' Rebellion in Western Massachusetts and the farmers are mobbing the federal bankruptcy courts because they can't pay their debts, the framers are concerned that mobs will rule. And that's why they come to Philadelphia to create a government strong enough to avoid mobs and constrained enough to protect liberty. And Madison is hopeful that this will solve the classical problem of needing face-to-face deliberation. Because after all, Madison says in Federalist 55, in all large assemblies of any character composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob. At the end of his life, Madison is moderately optimistic that the Republic will succeed, more so than the other framers, because he expects less of citizens. But he has great faith in a new media technology, the broadside press, that will allow complicated arguments like the Federalist Papers to be printed in newspapers so citizens can discuss them in coffee houses. And he thinks that this great technology, with the help of a class of enlightened journalists that he calls the literati, will allow reason slowly to diffuse across the land. But it all depends on public education and on this great media technology. obviously very different from our world of Instagram and X or whatever it's called. And the idea of a world where posts based on passion travel further and faster than those based on reason is very far from Madison's hope. And Madison's deep hope that citizens will engage in self-education and self-mastery turns on his faith that they'll engage in deep reading, which is another reason why it's so important for all of us to read daily. I cannot leave you without talking about another great son of Boston, John Quincy Adams. Let's have him, please. If I had to pick a favorite, which you're not supposed to do, it would be Quincy Adams, because he most completely exemplifies the classical virtues and a life of mindful self-improvement. He's being hit over the head ever since he's a kid by John and Abigail. Abigail is always telling him, master your unreasonable passions, quoting the Proverbs, and John also exhorting him, you're never alone when you have a poet in your pocket. Use every moment productively to improve yourself. And this creates in John Quincy a constant, relentless urge for self-improvement and a sense that he's not doing enough to use his time productively. I thought that having a Jewish mom was motivating. Having a Puritan mom turns out to be even tougher, because Abigail was very, very tough on John. And as a result, he always feels like he's a slacker. There's this great moment in his early 30s. He's just been nominated to the US Supreme Court, turned down the appointment because he wants to stay as minister to St. Petersburg. And he writes in his diary, I'm 30 something years old. I'm a complete failure. I'm making a hash of it. I'm not using my time productively. I'm spending too much time at the theater. I'm eating and drinking too much. Adams says, if only I had some self-discipline, I might have ended war and slavery. He sets a very high bar for himself. And then, of course, he's such a great classicist. He's the first Boylston professor of rhetoric at Harvard, and he writes a book on Cicero's oratory, which John sends to Jefferson as a present, a kind of makeup gift, which he calls some homespun from John Quincy, which Jefferson receives gratefully. Quincy Adams is elected president in that contested election of 24. He has a tough first term, loses the election of 28 to Jackson in a rematch, and suffers terrible tragedies, both his presidential defeat and also a family tragedy. His oldest son, George Washington Adams, commits suicide. He can't take the pressure of being named George Washington Adams. Also, the letters that his father wrote to him, letters from a Christian to his son, where John Quincy, who's a deep Bible reader and has sensitive and original primary text interpretations of the Bible, is always exhorting George to be perfect, as Jesus exhorted the disciples to be perfect. Too much for George Washington Adams, who descends into alcoholism and then jumps off a steamship and kills himself. And Adams is overwhelmed with grief. And he and Abigail walk around Harvard Square in Cambridge trying to pray for solace in the face of this crushing blow. And what does Adams do? Well, he spends a year rereading Cicero in the original, in particular the Tusculan Disputations, and takes from the Tusculan Disputations a phrase that he makes his motto throughout life: I plant for the benefit of future generations. That becomes the motto of Adams House at Harvard. That was my undergraduate dorm. I didn't know any of these things, but isn't it incredible that John Quincy Adams's motto is from the Tusculan Disputations, which is his favorite book. He writes sonnets of virtue based on this learning, and then he emerges from his time of reflection and reinvents himself as the greatest abolitionist of his age, who Frederick Douglass praises for doing more to end slavery than any other white man of his time. And he introduces constitutional amendments to end slavery. He denounces the gag rule, which prohibits the introduction of abolitionist petitions on the floor of the House, which he returns to as a representative from Massachusetts. He votes against the war in Mexico, and his last words after he collapses of a stroke on the floor of the House and is carried to a sofa, he murmurs, I am composed. And he gets this from Cicero, the ideal of the perfectly self-composed man as he who's achieved the tranquility that defines virtuous happiness. It's so inspiring. Let me end, and now I'll go into questions in a moment, by sharing with you the most amazing passage from Quincy Adams on the Jubilee of the Constitution in 1839. I don't have it right in front of me, so I won't read it exactly, but he's quoting Deuteronomy to emphasize the urgent importance of studying the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution. And he says, make these principles as a frontlet between your eyes, whisper them to your children before you go to bed, speak of them when you wake and you sleep, make them the principles of your political salvation. It's just extraordinary. And that's how urgently important Quincy Adams thinks it is to learn the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution: liberty, equality, natural rights, government by consent, separation of powers. All of these, unless we hold to these principles as the ark of our political salvation, we will descend into demagogues and mobs, and in Adams's time, civil war. And then, of course, as Lincoln said, and the war came. I have chapters on Lincoln and Frederick Douglass too, and I'll say a word about them too, but let me start to take your great questions, if I may. There have been some great ones in the chat, and let me take some of those, and then I'll go to the ones that you wrote in advance. I was surprised in reading Pursuit how seldom the founders seemed to turn to Christianity for their thoughts on virtue, turning instead to pagan classical writers. What does that say about their views on religion? I don't think that was right. I of course just took Jefferson's reading list. That was my project. And Jefferson was a deist, was less orthodox in his faith, certainly, than almost all of the other founders, although many were eclectic. And yet, I also read all the Christian sources that contained the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, that the other founders used to influence their writings on virtue and happiness, like Wollaston and Tillotson. And Franklin first used the phrase, the pursuit of happiness. He said it when he was in Philadelphia, and he's getting it from the so-called reasonable Christian writers, which he's setting. So I think that although the founders differed, of course, in their own faith and their own conception of the divine and their own orthodoxy, certainly all believed in the divine, as Jefferson did, and felt that we have not only a right but a duty to embrace divine reason and to align with the harmonies of the universe, as Jefferson would put it, or to obey the will of God, as John Quincy, a more Orthodox Christian, would have put it. And Quincy, of course, is a deep Bible reader. He, by the way, it's his own original reading of the Bible that leads him to say that Jesus's promise to free the captives is a prophecy of the end of slavery, and he uses that to insist that ending slavery is a divine duty. So all this is to say, I distilled from all of the sources: Christian, classical, Blackstone on law, Whig Enlightenment philosophers, and the opponents of the British monarchy. Certain basic principles, they all come back to reason, passion, impulse control, using your powers of reason to check your unreasonable passions and emotions, and avoiding immediate gratification. But they did it in different faith traditions, and for many of them, the Bible was central. Is there a list of the books you read in your book, or do you have a referral of where to find them? Yes, indeed. The book has an appendix with the top 10 books on happiness in the founding era, and I took them mostly from Jefferson's reading list, but also ranked them in the order of popularity. And please, you can get the book for them, but they include Cicero's Tusculan Disputations and On Duties, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. If you want a place to start and you're interested in this moral philosophy, I would start with Aurelius and a good modern translation. He's the most accessible. Cicero, although very important, is not a romp. So you might want to begin with Aurelius, who millions of people through the ages have found an inspiring and very practical advice, a manual of self-mastery. Seneca's essays, which Washington loved. Epictetus's Enchiridion, which John and Abigail and John Quincy liked a lot. Quincy said that Epictetus prepares us most effectually for the evils of life. Plutarch's Lives, so famous, the shared, the pairings of Greek and Roman heroes inspired many generations. Xenophon's Memorabilia of Socrates. Franklin loved it so much that when a young girl was reading Xenophon, she said, "Mama, he talks just like Dr. Franklin," because Franklin loved that Socratic style. Hume's essays, so beautiful, central to the Federalist Papers. Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws for the Political Philosophy and Separation of Powers. Of course, that's the most cited book in the founding era. Locke, everyone thinks that the Declaration comes from the two treatises, which has the famous phrase, we're born in a state of nature with natural rights to life, liberty, and property. And it's long been a question, why did Jefferson substitute pursuit of happiness? And many have assumed that pursuit of happiness is a synonym for property, but that's not right, because the phrase the pursuit of happiness in Locke appears not in the two treatises, but in the essay concerning human understanding, where in chapter 51, Locke talks about our duty to pursue happiness by using our reason to master our, immediate passions. And the reason that Jefferson chooses happiness, not property, is because he's talking about unalienable rights, and property is an alienable right. Of course, you have to alienate to government the power to regulate property. That's why we form governments, to enforce contracts. Plus, you have to alienate property as a form of exchange. By contrast, happiness is rooted in reason, and reason is unalienable because it's inherent in who we are. I can't alienate to you the power to control my thoughts. They are the product of my reason, which is core to who I am as a human being. So that's why Jefferson rightly chose happiness, not property, and he got it from the essay concerning human understanding, not the two treatises. And then Smith's Moral Theory of Sentiments. But if you want to really dig in for extra credit, and please do, check out the Robert Skipwith reading list. Jefferson, I cited in the book, but you can Google it. Founders Online, by the way, is this golden resource, which you must check out. It has the digitized papers of everyone, all the major founders, including all the great work that the Massachusetts Historical Society did in collecting the papers of the Adamses. They're all online, and the Founders Online. And you'll find there, if you put in Jefferson and Skipwith or whatever, you'll quickly, or reading list, you'll find this reading list, which includes not only the moral philosophy, there we go, we're getting the link there. Thank you, Kristen. Not only the moral philosophy, but he has a whole section on literature, including his favorite novelist, Lawrence Sterne, and political philosophy and history. Jefferson's favorite historian is Tacitus. He writes to Adams, "I've given up newspapers for Tacitus, and I feel much better." I tried to read Tacitus after finishing this book, as well as Jefferson's favorite Greek historians, and I found it heavy going until I discovered this great translation of Tacitus written by Gordon and Trenchard, who wrote Cato's letters. They're the great Whig polemicists who inspire the revolution with Cato's letters. And Trenchard and Gordon, they have this great kind of annotation of Tacitus where they're like, here's how he's relevant to teaching us about our current struggles against the king. And this teaches us that consolidated power always leads to murder. And it's kind of like a annotated blog version of Tacitus, which is easier going than the unannotated version. So that's a great place to find the reading list. But of course, make your own reading list. The goal is just to keep learning and growing and find, the main thing for me was just a disciplined reading schedule, and having, in particular, a time of day for reading, for me, helps me make it a daily habit. And for Franklin and all of these founders, it's all about habits. Hearing this different perspective of happiness, I wonder how it impacted Franklin's writing of the Declaration, the pursuit of happiness as an unalienable right. Well, the thing is, of course, when Jefferson writes the draft, but Adams is on the committee along with Franklin, and this is just in the air. Jefferson says, I'm not doing anything original. I'm just channeling philosophers of public right, such as Aristotle, Cicero, Philip Sidney, and Locke. and those are the ones he calls out, but all the ones on his reading list. I found, it's incredible. You use these electronic word searches. It's such a glorious time to be doing research. Almost all of those books on the reading list in the moral philosophy section contain the phrase, the pursuit of happiness. And Jefferson's right that he's not doing anything original. He has before him George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights, which he really copies almost word for word. The preamble looks at an awful lot like the preamble to the Declaration, as well as Adams's thoughts on government, James Wilson's essay concerning the extent of legislative authority, which has footnotes that I went through and cite to many of the same sources. So what I'm saying is, this is not anything. Jefferson was not being original, and none of them was making anything up. They read this as kids. They imbued it in college. They read it from all these different sources, and Jefferson was distilling the basic principles of the American mind, as he so beautifully put it, in ways that were more eloquently expressed than ever before, but made no pretense to originality. Are the virtues and emotional moderation, harking back to Stoicism and the Greeks? Well, yes, much. It really goes back to Pythagoras, who turns out to be the guy who originated the distinction between reason and passion. Plato divides it into three parts: reason, passion, and emotion, with reason in the head, passion or emotion in the heart, and desire in the stomach, and imagines the metaphor of the charioteer with two horses, one noble and one appetitive, and the goal of the charioteer, representing reason, is to align the horses so they're pulling in the same direction. But it's much like the Eastern notions of the elephant and the rider, or the ancient Hebrew distinctions between the Yetzer Hazer and the Yetzer Hara. What's so striking, as the founders recognize, is that all of the wisdom traditions of the East and the West emphasize these virtues of emotional moderation. They're not the Christian virtues of faith, hope, and charity. They are the classical virtues of temperance, prudence, courage, and justice, but the Christian tradition very much embraced those, and Aquinas read Cicero. Basically, everything goes back to Cicero because that's what everyone read. And there's such a consonance of all the traditions in this beautiful wisdom. Marcy says that in the book, I talk about Adams's efforts to understand the similarities among the traditions. How might we carry out a similar quest today in public life to discern civic virtue with respect to our American experiment and the efforts of Christian nationalists to seize the stage, asserting almighty authority? Thank you. Well, it's such an important question, and we now understand why the founders insisted on the Establishment Clause, which prohibits a national church from being established, because of their inspiring commitment to the illimitable freedom of the human mind, as Jefferson puts it. And Jefferson, he has three achievements on his tombstone that he's proudest of: the Declaration, UVA, and the Virginia Bill on Religious Freedom. And it's so inspiring to see Jefferson distilling the idea of conscience being an unalienable right. He says that the opinions of men, being dependent on the evidence contemplated by their own minds, cannot be controlled by other men and women. And that is why the attempts by any group to assert authority by force and orthodoxy rather than reason and reflection is antithetical to the American experiment. The experiment, as Hamilton said in the Federalist Papers, is designed to test whether men can be governed by reason and conviction, not force and violence. The Virginia Bill on Religious Freedom says that the opinions of men, being dependent on evidence contemplated by their own mind, can't be controlled by others, and talks about the right and duty to form our opinions based on reason and conviction, not force or violence. So there's this beautiful symmetry of the Enlightenment faith and reason, which is completely consistent with faith, but cannot be commandeered or hijacked by any sect, by any monkish superstition, as Jefferson put it, by any group that claims that it has exclusive authority to the truth or demands on orthodoxy in the performance of our duties of conscience. And I think that by deep reading and joining me in this radical project of mastery and growth through deep reading, we can recover this Enlightenment tradition, emphasize its consonance with faith traditions, and also emphasize the alien nature of those who would hijack our government on behalf of their particular conception of the truth. Gosh, so many other great questions here. I did want to go to some of the ones that came in advance, and let me just note some of them, which includes as some were enslavers, how did they square their definition of the term with the enslaved of the land? They really didn't. It's so important to note that none of them, not Jefferson or any, said that slavery was anything other than a violation of natural law and the Bible, although they were quite hypocritical about living up to that distinction. That relates to another question about the degree to which the founders looked to the Bible for guidance. In putting together their ideals, they turned to the Bible, many of them daily, for spiritual guidance about how to live. But their notion of the structures of government, as well as the constitutions of our mind, are channeled through the Enlightenment sources. Locke, of course, is deeply religious as well, and thinks Christianity is compatible with reason and embraces the Bible, but it's through this framework of emotional self-mastery. So those are all some completely great questions. Just a few more that were coming in. Process question: do you take notes as you read in the morning, and what format? I really do love Kindle because you can take notes so well and highlight stuff and put footnotes that I can then go back and use for my writing. And I love the physical book, but online is great for me. And Audible is wonderful too. What a wonderful way of using your leisure time on the treadmill or walking in nature to listen to books or music. And now I must, as we're ending our time together, say what a marvelous time it is, friends, to be living in this world where all of the books and music of the world are online and available to us at any moment of the day. When I was a kid, I was so full of wonder when I went to the Library of Congress with my mom for the first time, and standing in the beautiful Jefferson building, realized that all the books in the world were in that majestic space. And now they're all online, and I carry them around in my pocket every day, and on YouTube or on Spotify, I can hear the greatest performances of all of the 20th century, of the greatest music ever. And all I need is the self-discipline to read and engage in deep listening rather than browsing and tweeting. And that's what I'm urging to you. And let us give thanks that despite all of the challenges that afflict America and societies around the world, we have within our pockets the capacity to engage in feats of learning and wonder and growth that the founders could only dreamed of. And all we need is the commitment to use our time well and to do it. So I guess I'll end with that. And thank you so much.
So much, Jeff, for sharing your remarkable insights, truly the fruits of deep reading. And we really enjoyed this exploration of the minds of the founders and opinion leaders. What a great intellectual history, and what a tour of thoughts behind our country's founding. We'll all head off to read Marcus Aurelius and Cicero. As we do for all our authors in the American Inspiration series, we've asked Jeff to do a brief reading again from his book, this one from his book. And I believe, Jeff, it's an original work of yours. Is that correct? A sonnet?
It's one of these sonnets that I'll share with you. Absolutely. It's from Cicero, and I would just kind of sum up the wisdom in these sonnet forms. So here it is. It's notes on Cicero's Tusculan disputations. This morning haze obscures the firmament, sunlight and clouds in serried blue alloy. A narrow clearing opens, fortune sent. I glimpse a sparkling sunbeam and feel joy. Stoics praise calm joy without elation, its motion placid and to reason aligned. When it transports with wanton exultation, it fires the perturbations of the mind. The four disordered passions are emotions that lack the moderation reason brings. Elation, lust, fear, grief are their commotions. Prudence and temperance are their golden rings. The soul that's tranquil, calm, restrained, at rest. The happy soul, the subject of our quest. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I guess we need to be reading and writing as a daily practice. That was a beautiful sonnet, not an easy feat. Jeff Rosen's book epitomizes lifelong learning. It's education he took during COVID and is clearly ongoing. And I really encourage you, don't miss the chance to sharpen your understanding of these philosophers and the reasons and actions that are at the foundation of our country. It is truly inspiring to have heard from him tonight and to have his reading list. Kristen, back to you for more information and on tonight's closing.
Thank you very much, Margaret, and thank you, Jeff Rosen. On behalf of the partners for tonight's program and the staff behind the scenes, thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Good night.